Daughter's off at dinosaur camp, which sounds a lot more fun than what we're going to talk about for an hour and a half. Just kidding. A little late opening the door, bike down, ready to talk about education, which I hope you are. You all are here because it's a policy debate camp. They choose a topic. The topic goes to every state, all of the debate stuff. And this year they have chosen very carefully, and you may want to write this down. This is the resolution. You could also Google it. The United States federal government, and we would write that as USFG. The United States federal government should substantially increase its, okay, and now here we're going to get funky, funding and or regulation. Funding and or regulation. That phrase and or has been in college debate for quite a while. High school debate not so popular. For some reason they picked it up. Funding and or regulation of elementary and or secondary, oh my goodness, elementary and or secondary education in the United States. So the government can't be funding education in Vietnam, it's got to be here in the United States. That is the resolution. That is the starting point for dividing debates that happen all year long. I've had a conversation with my lab about this. This is less of a conversation, it's more of a bunch of facts. The first part is just going to be some history so that you don't sound like you know nothing when you start talking about education. Although for the first time in a long time I feel that my ability to talk about this is probably less than most of the average people you'll have in your classrooms, which is what's really cool about this topic. The second part, I'm going to talk about the different types of funding that exists in the United States. Where does it come from? What's it do? I'm going to talk about regulations. And those sound like they're going to be separate, but you're going to find out that they are really very closely tied, the fundings and the regulations. And then I'm going to conclude with a discussion of the kind of like what you think affirmatives will get to say and what you think negatives get to say, and just sort of like drawing our battle lines for arguments that we're going to have about education all year long. If there are any questions where I need to explain something more, like what does that word mean, or could you talk about that or spell that better, something like that, I'll take those questions. The questions I don't want to have are like, this one time in my classroom, my teacher said this. Is that true? I have no idea. Probably. I make stuff up. That's okay. Write it down. Ask your lab leaders. Viva, half my age, knows twice as much. Wait and ask him. Everyone got that? But I can spell, I can Google, I've written stuff down, and I want to make sure that it's not over anyone's head. Category 1, elementary and secondary education in the United States. What is it? A subpoint, elementary schools. These are defined as everything, according to the Department of Education, quote, pre-secondary. Secondary education has been defined for a very long time, like 1852 they came up with the definition of that, and so elementary came along later, and it's literally everything pre that. A more useful definition of elementary is everything from 4 years old through high school. Although some people think that elementary school is from birth to high school. So a little broader category there. I found this number fascinating. 92,858 elementary schools according to the Department of Education in the U.S. 92,858 elementary schools in the United States. That just blows my mind. There are 92,000. I don't think I've ever seen 92,000 people, and there are 92,000 elementary schools. Of those, 68,000 are public, which means, and I'll define this a little bit better later, they receive and run on government money, and they are open for everyone within a geographic area. Open to everyone in a geographic areas. So elementary schools are governed by what we call Board of Educations, BOEs, And they vary from state to state to state. Someone in my lab raised their hand. They're like, I don't remember taking that test. And I was like, I'm fairly certain that test is federally mandated for all elementary schools. Looked it up. No, it's not. It's regionally mandated for regional accreditations. All these elementary schools are very, very different. All 92,000 of them. In addition to that, you've got 25,000 roughly private elementary schools in the United States. These are non-profit schools that require a tuition or money from a benefactor, a donation to function, to provide education to kids. In addition to elementary schools, I want to briefly mention pre-Ks and Head Start programs. These are not pre-elementary schools that are federally funded. Head Start is a federally funded program for kids who want to teach them elementary school skills before they go there. And of course, pre-K programs also exist and get some federal money. That's your K4, your K3, stuff like that. That's before those elementary schools, and there's countless number of those. Those are usually not ran by the state, but the federal money does give some money for them. B sub point, secondary education. This is the much broader category. There's a lot more literature about it. Secondary education is defined as the last 4 years of public education. Grades 9th through 12th. The first public secondary school is believed to have started in 1830. 1830. And we're like, we need to get 9th through 12th graders together. Our last 4 years. In 1892, the first sort of federal program called, quote, the Committee of 10 was started, and they established the National Education Association. This is 1892, the National Education Association. And they sat around and they said, to be educated in the United States, you need 12 years of schooling. 1892 is when they came up with that. They then said, we need 8 years of elementary education and 4 years of high school. That's how it was defined in 1892. So if it ever feels random to you, well, it's because it's, almost 125 years old at this point. The two fights that were happening at the time in 1892 were that some people wanted schools that taught people basic skills to prepare them for college, to prepare them for to move on and to continue to educate yourself. The big pushback was from trade groups, farmers, industrialists, who wanted, this education's a waste. You're going to educate my kid, teach them about tilling the soil or making leather properly. And that group, the Committee of 10, their founding principle is, quote, every subject should be taught in the same way to every pupil, no matter the probable destination of what the pupil may be. It's pretty revolutionary at the time. First country to do that. It said every student should be taught in the exact same way. It doesn't matter if they're likely to be a doctor, if they're guaranteed to be a farmer, it doesn't matter. They should all be given the same educational opportunities, and it sort of set the standard for what education would be. That kind of went on quite a while. America was changing a little bit. 1954, there was a case in front of the Supreme Court, often called Brown v. Board. Brown v. Board. A person named Brown sued the Board of Education. Said the schools are separate. There's white schools, there's black schools. They exist as totally separate things. This is unconstitutional. It is unfair. And they had desegregation, became constitutionally required. Desegregation. S-E-G-R-E-T-A-T-I-O-N. Desegregation. Segregated means separated out. Desegregated, so that they did not have to be separated out anymore. Two big things happened right after 1954. They started establishing policies for how they were going to do that, things like busing. And they would just take a population of kids, say, hey, we need to send you over there to go to this school. We need to send you over here to go to this school. We are literally going to solve this by just moving people around to have to go to school with each other. And second, we had a massive explosion of private schools in the United States in the late 50s and 60s. Most of the private schools that exist all started sometime between like 54 to 70. Not all of them. There are some older ones. There's a massive explosion. We're talking 20,000 elementary schools popped up over the next decade. 1965. So when we had the first sort of federal jump into curriculum. So not federal involvement in who had to go to a school, but the first federal sort of like, this is what you should be teaching. It was called the ESEA. Well, it wasn't called that. That's how it's written down. ESEA. Elementary and Secondary Education Act. ESEA. It was one of the first laws passed by President Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson was first of many presidents to declare war on something that wasn't another country. Does anyone know who LBJ declared war on? Yes, sir?
Poverty.
Poverty. We're going to fight poverty. He declared war on it. And so one of the first things was we're going to get involved in education. The war on poverty. And that's where another phrase that comes up is Title I funding. And one is written like Roman numeral I whenever you see it. Title I funding came from the ESEA. Here's a really fun and confusing fact we kind of talked about. The federal government has been changing these laws since the 50s. They don't pass new laws because that'd be controversial. They don't want to do that. They change these laws. So I'm going to talk later about the No Child Left Behind Act. It's actually the No Child Left Behind amendments of the 1964 ESEA, or the amendment to that, or the Title VI of that. They keep adding on the laws, not changing it. So it is fairly confusing to read all of this. But the first one was the ESEA. So the federal government really got involved. Interestingly enough, the ESEA had a line in it that forbid the establishment of a national curriculum. There was a lot of fighting. A lot of senators, a lot of members of the House said, we don't want the federal government involved in our education. We don't want Washington telling us what to teach our kids. And so to get this passed and to help them, really beat up poverty, he explicitly said, we will not tell you what to teach. There will be no national standard of this is what you have to teach. Charter schools are something you'll hear about in the news. The first school to allow charter schools was Minnesota. It was in 1991. Charter schools are schools that exist. They want to provide public funding, but for a particular mission. Hey, we want to teach kids to do this. We would like some public funding. And they can work it out in a bunch of states. Minnesota was the first in 1991. There are now 41 of them and the District of Columbia. Most charter schools are known to have a waiting list. This is a big argument in favor of them made by people, that everyone wants to go to this charter school. They should get more money. Their justification is usually, the program is not provided, the public school that exists in my county, in my area, it stinks. They're not doing a good job for the kids. We would like to start a different school for a smaller group. We want a little bit of money from the government to start it up. We're going to provide a very specific education. They usually tie it around a particular curriculum. They get a little bit of funding, and they exist. So these are charter schools. You see them all the time. You'll hear about them on the radio. You probably have heard mom or dad complain about them, something like that. Or teachers hate them, or some teachers love them, or it depends on who the principal is. All sorts of stuff like that, but charter schools are now a thing. The last big thing I want to make sure we've got in history is the No Child Left Behind Act. No Child Left Behind Act. It was passed in 2001. You often see it written as NCLBA. NCLBA. No Child Left Behind. It's my favorite because anyone who's written an article on education since 2001 has come up with some fun pun around this, like every child left behind. You know, Title I, funding the children we leave behind, or, you know, something like that. Evidently all children are left behind, or some children are left behind, or the dyslexic students are left behind, or something like that. They work it into the title. It's got such a fun name. They love to play with it. Even some of the bills that have happened recently are like, they're play on words on that. They're like, catching all children up, you know, because you have to catch them up because we left some behind. We got it, and it's cute and it's funny. Passed in 2001, it required that all public schools receiving funding, must provide a statewide standardized test. If you want our money, for whatever reasons we're giving it to you, you're going to have to pass a statewide test, and you got to figure out what you're testing and let us know. Schools that receive Title I funding, and let me kind of define Title I there. It's part of the ESEA. Schools that lack the resources, are behind in funding. So, hey, this is all the money we have. They literally have to fill out a form to apply for a grant from the federal government. Or, if a percentage of the student population, I'm kind of talk slow because I want you to understand Title I. If a percentage of the student population is at 130% of the poverty level, make sure a certain percentage of the student population lives at 130% of the poverty level. Now, how in the heck are you at 130% of the poverty level? Well, the poverty level is defined, it changes every year, and it says to be considered in poverty, there's a line. It's like X number of dollars per number of people. So, family of one, you make, $30,000, you're not in poverty. Family of four, you make $58,000, you're not in poverty. And there's literally a measurement. And they use it in all things with the federal government, whether we're talking about welfare or Medicare or, in this case, Title I. They ask the whole school what's the percentage of people that are at 130% or less of the poverty level. If a substantial portion of the school population is that, the federal government says, here's some more money to help your school out. No Child Left Behind said that all of those schools must meet AYP test scores. AYP test scores. Adequate yearly progress. Adequate yearly progress. In Atlanta, it was a big to-do not too long ago. There was literally a suit that passed. A bunch of people got fired because they found that some teachers, concerned that the schools wouldn't make the AYP, were giving students the answers. They were saying, hey everybody, number 7 is B. Everybody got that? 7 is B. Or they were giving them some questions beforehand because, as teachers, they wanted to make the AYP to guarantee Title I funding to make sure that the curriculum and the teacher salaries and the funding was available there. No Child Left Behind, while it funds certain curriculum goals like STEM, S-T-E-M, it's an acronym. It means science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Did require that a curriculum be written, but does not itself mandate a particular curriculum. So Common Core is something that I hear lots of parents complaining about. Common Core math. It's not the way I learned to do math in my head. You know, or, oh, the books are changing. Those things are set by regional accreditation groups and states for testing across the state. They can mean it, that sort of stuff. There are 4 types of schools. This is kind of my next section after secondary that I want to make sure that you are aware of. The first, I've already defined, so I'm going to put it first, charter schools. Charter schools are subject to fewer rules and regulations, largely because they remain undefined, which allows them to kind of do what they want to a little bit more. Each state currently sets a fixed amount per student for that charter school. They will fix the gap by getting, you know, a donation, a rich benefactor, something like that, and I'll take the school. So if you give me $100 per student, I take 1,000 students in, bing, bang, boom, I got a $100,000 budget for my school, and we'll have to meet that. There are an estimated 6,800 public schools in the 42 states that allow them, and the District of Columbia. 41 states that allow them. But that was 09. This is a little, tried to Google how many. 6,800 public charter schools. Second, there are university preparatory schools. This is the majority. University preparatory schools, all the way back in that early definition about what counts. The schools, particularly secondary schools, exist to prepare you for a university education. They are commonly referred to as prep schools. They can be publicly funded, they can be privately funded. They either have tuition fees, or they collect tax money, or they may have an independent board of trustees that raises money for them. To be a university prep school, you must be accredited by the 6 agencies that exist around the United States for making sure schools meet all sorts of standards. There's a whole bunch of random things that are not random, they're like numbers. Like, you must go to school this many days to be a university prep school. Teachers must be in the school this many days. You must offer X number of foreign language classes, X number of mathematics classes, all sorts of stuff like that. There are non-university preparatory schools. These are largely publicly funded schools, very small portion where students can get a different education, focus on shop, kind of forego usually the last year or 2 of the preparatory school, make their own decision with their parents that they want to get a different set of education. That is small in comparison to the 4th category I want to mention, which is homeschool. Well, maybe that's not a school or not. but I wanted to point out because roughly 3% of the U.S. population is homeschooled. Which makes it just over 2 million children. Homeschools also have sort of accreditation, like they have to meet certain curriculum. You can't just be like, oh, my child's homeschooled, so I'm not teaching them anything. Parents have to agree to give them some certain tests at the end of the year, meet certain standards, all that sort of stuff. So 3 million students are homeschooled. Homeschooling, you know, they have their own sort of like organized things. There's homeschool debate tournaments that exist. There are homeschool basketball leagues. They've organized around doing all sorts of stuff like that. So 3% of the population is pretty large. The final thing on history I'd be remiss if I didn't mention before I go on to sort of the role of the federal government is vouchers. Vouchers is the big hot controversy of the day. It is unclear where they stand because the Obama administration was very anti-voucher. The Trump administration ran under many confusing statements, but one of them was that they would fund and push towards a school voucher system. And you ask, what is that? Well, it takes a bunch of different forms, but the main thesis of it is citizens shouldn't be forced to spend their tax money on public schools that are failing them. If they want to pay for a private school, they should get a voucher, which I kind of think of as a coupon. It's like good for one free tuition waiver, good for X amount of money towards tuition. And then if your parents want to use that money to pay a tuition to a private school, they should be able to do that. That's what a voucher is. Usually it's post-tax, so you still pay your taxes, but then you get it afterwards, and you can kind of use it. And so once schools start using it, that money is then taken out of the public school's amount of money. They don't get that for that student, and that student can then use it elsewhere. A couple of examples I want to point out. There's the state of Indiana have education savings accounts, which are vouchers for your tax money that you can put into a savings account. It's usually pre-tax, so a portion of your check when you get it at the end of the year says like this amount of money went into a little account. You can then use that account to pay for private school. You can use that account to pay for homeschool stuff if you want. You can do it for just about anywhere. Washington, D.C. has what's called the D.C. voucher system. Separate from anywhere else, the D.C. public schools were so notoriously bad that they kind of agreed that it would be unjust to force students to go there. So if you live in D.C., you can choose to participate in the voucher program, literally get a check that you can sign over to whatever private school that you want to attend that instead. The public schools don't get your money. There's a whole bunch that exist all over the state, clearly being debated. There's the not just the voucher system and the education savings account. I believe it's Arizona where they were discussing sort of a pre-tax property tax opt-out. You don't have to pay the portion of your property tax that the county says you want to go to, but then you can't take advantage of the public schools. It was sort of like people should only be paying for the schools if they're using the schools sort of thing. You've seen this in Georgia. Decatur here just recently passed a law that said that anyone over a certain age with no children living with them could lower their tax bill. Like they're not paying for the schools, so why should they? They're not using the schools, so why should they not have to use them? So vouchers, big hot topics going on currently. Lots of pros, lots of cons. I just want to kind of mention very quickly that the pros for this are literally summarized as people shouldn't be forced to attend bad schools. And the con against it is this is what makes schools bad. taking funding that schools need to be good and letting them use it elsewhere. And then the other major con is you have to make so much money to be able to afford tuition, even if the voucher covers a lot of it. So it's basically just helping rich people pay for the private education they're going to pay for anyway. That catches us up to date on the history of education in the United States. Very cursory. I encourage you to read some more stuff. The Wikipedia article's got a bunch of links down at the bottom. Feel free to read about it. Feel free to ask your teacher about any sort of stuff that they've learned about the history of education. Brown v. Board is absolutely fascinating. Segregation, all sorts of movements that happen. It will be a big part of the topic that's happening now. Section 2 is the role of the federal government. The role of the federal government. The Constitution very clearly said that all powers not expressly given to the federal government, everything the federal government didn't say, we're in charge of this, remains with the states. The 10th Amendment of the Constitution. Everything we don't claim, you claim. I kind of like to think of it as like all of the old dudes sitting around talking about the Constitution. They just left the king. They're like, wait a minute, what about all the stuff we didn't mention? And I said, you know what, let's make sure we throw this in here. Everything we didn't mention should stay with the states. The states are in charge of that. Education was the thing that was most thought about. And so it was a discussion about what role Congress has. And then they invented something called the Department of Education. The DOE came along. And its charter explicitly states that the role of the federal government is limited to regulating and enforcing constitutional rights in schools. Regulating and enforcing constitutional rights in schools. That was the one thing everyone agreed the federal government, from the beginning, should be involved in when it comes to education. Someone in your high school is violating your First Amendment rights, federal government should jump in. Someone's violating your privacy rights, federal government should jump in. A lot of these regulations we're going to talk about fall under sort of that authority. However, since the 50s, as you'll notice, there's been an increase in indirect authority. The federal government has begun to do stuff. I want you to write these down. There's the federal funding of national programs. Now, here's a program, here's some money, it's an initiative that we want to do. There have also been block grants to meet federal obligations, like Title I. It says, here's a block grant of money for people who need it, that want some money and stuff. And third, most of the federal money is an option, not an obligation. An option, not an obligation. We would like for you to do this. If you do it, I'll give you some money. If you don't do it, that's okay. Don't worry about it. That's the way that they kind of take a hands-off approach to federal funding, right? Like, you know what? I'll give you $1 billion if you do this thing, but don't feel obligated. Only if you want the money. Some states don't take the money. Some states say, we're good, we don't want to do that. It's absolutely fine. My favorite example along these lines is that there's a similar law of block grants for seatbelt laws in this country. The federal government was very hands-off on how they rolled the Department of Transportation. I like to say that. And then all of a sudden they noticed that states with seatbelt laws were being highly successful for it. And then they said, you know what? You don't have to have seatbelt laws, but if you do, we'll give you an extra $1 million. All states but one have been taking the money since the beginning. And remember, what state is like, we don't want that money? New Hampshire, the libertarian state. They're just like, you know what? We don't need your stinking money. People don't want to wear their seatbelt. That's their right. They don't have to do that. Helmets either. We're New Hampshire. Live free or die. It's literally right there on the bottom of the plate. Education, some of the states have been taking the New Hampshire approach to a lot of the things that I say. There's not very many federal programs that exist that are regulations in terms of you have to do this. Even No Child Left Behind and the AYPs that they require. If a school doesn't want to do it, do they have to do it? Absolutely not. There's no legal requirement. There's no cops that are going to show up to shut a school down. There's nothing like that that's going to exist. If a school wants to be totally awful or totally awesome and ignore the federal government, it's totally up to them. And that's sort of the big picture way that funding and regulations work. So, let's talk about funding. A little bit of some statistics to start off with you. All three levels of government fund education in the United States. There's, of course, federal. There's also state funding. And there's a whole bunch of local funding. There is no national statistics for this because it changes from state to state. There are different laws. It's in a lot of state constitutions about how much money goes to schools or how they have to share funding. Some of the states have laws that say that counties have to share the money equally. Some say it doesn't matter. Each neighborhood can keep their own money. Some states say that the state funds all come together and then we'll share them evenly amongst every student. That changes every state you go to. But nationally, about 45 to 48% of the money comes from states. Little under half of the money comes from the state government for education. On average, local governments provide about 45% of the money that goes to education for elementary and secondary schools. Which means from 2010 to present, the federal government was only responsible for about 13%, obviously that varies from state to state, of the total direct money spent on schools. Only 13%. Very small portion of the total amount of money that's spent on schools. Obviously, there are some schools like Title I schools with low income where that's much higher. And then there are some schools in states with tons of money that they overpay for it and that sort of stuff where it is set. Because of that, a lot of the standards for how much is spent is set at the local level. They control 44%. So how much do teachers make? There's a joke, the teachers, are underpaid and that sort of stuff. I want to confirm that they are grossly underpaid. But it also changes big time from county to county to county to county. When I got rid of graduate school, my wife wanted to go to pharmacy school, and I was like, you know what, I'm tired of school, I'm not going to this PhD program, didn't really enjoy it. I think I'm going to try my hand teaching high school. This is going to be great. And my first thought was, let's go back to my hometown. My wife can drive to pharmacy school. This is going to be good. And I apply for it, and I'm looking, and I sit down with the principal. He's like, we'd love to have you. It's going to be great. And then I go to this other school, Chattahoochee, up in North Fulton County, and I talk to them, and I sit down. The principal's like, we'd love to have you. And I sit down with my wife, and my hometown versus Chattahoochee was $28,000 more to teach in Fulton County every year than it was to go to my hometown and teach. $28,000 more to do the same job with the same, different kids, but with the same age group, all sorts of stuff like that. I was like, this is an easy decision. To me, that just kind of stands out about how different each local group could be and that sort of stuff. And we even did the stuff where we sat down and we're like, well, it is pretty cheap to live there, and it's pretty expensive to live in Atlanta. No, it wasn't $28,000 a year difference to do the exact same job. Stuff like that happens across the board. Textbooks, teachers, amount of money that's available for athletics, for extracurricular activities, all sorts of stuff. So there's a lot of inequality across the board in terms of what's available for teachers, students. In the 1970s, that's when states overtook local governments. So from 1840s until 1974, every single year, a majority of the funding came from local. State involvement in education is a fairly recent phenomenon. That 13% the federal government spends, that's about $40 billion a year. $40 billion a year. There are two types of federal funding. The first is discretionary. Discretionary, D-I-S-C-R-E-T-I-O-N-A-R-Y. Discretionary means that it is set every year. They pass a bill, it's the budget, it says how much funding is going to be. All education funding is discretionary. It could go away next year. It's not set in stone. That's different from entitlement funding. Entitlement, E-N-T-I-T-L-E-M-E-N-T, like you're entitled to it. Entitled funding is stuff that is guaranteed by law, whether Congress passes it in a budget bill or not. None of education funding is set up that way. The only things that are really set up that way are things like Social Security, Medicaid. There's a percentage of the military budget that's set up as entitled, all sorts of stuff like that. Just it gets paid no matter what. Almost all of the money, but not all of it, funds through the Department of Education's budget. Though there are some others we're going to talk about in a little bit that do spend some money on elementary and secondary education. Most of it goes through that. The two biggest funded things, and they are huge categories, they make up 24 billion of the 30 billion, 40 billion by themselves, are Title I, No Child Left Behind grants. Roughly 14 billion of it in 2013 went to that. Title I, No Child Left Behind grants are those AYPs. It's money for schools to get Title I money. That's the big chunk of the change. It's in balancing out some discrepancy for groups that live in poverty. The second big one is IDEA. IDEA. We'll talk about that, the acronym a little bit. It's basically disabilities. Special Education State Grants. And that was roughly $11 billion. IDEA, Special Education State Grants. That's money that the federal government is handing out for states that meet special education requirements for students with disabilities. Those are the two big categories. There are going to be some others. When we talk about education funding, those two make up 60+% of it. Okay, here are some of the others that come up with federal education. I mentioned that. The other big one is the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture. It coordinates the funding for all of the child nutrition programs. School lunches, school breakfast, after-school snack programs, all sorts of stuff like that. The original school nutrition program was started during the Great Depression and existed for a very specific reason. To make sure that kids had food to eat. It was literally written to combat starvation. It was the government's way of saying, okay, not enough food going around, people are literally starving to death. Let's make sure that kids, if they're willing to show up at school, get a good meal so they don't die of starvation. Actual physical starvation has not been mentioned in the last few USDA bills. Now they're far more interested in things like the health, the nutrition standards, that food pyramid that exists, making sure that kids are aware of that, involved in that, that sort of stuff. The USDA also works with poultry and beef farmers to buy up whatever's remaining and then sell it to schools or give it to schools in terms of that. What? Okay, stop it. Got it. I thought you said, can you spell it? And I was like, nutrition, N-U-T-R-I-T-I-O-N. I got that. Let's leave the chairs alone. Second group, there's a Department of Health and Human Services, DHHS. Department of Health and Human Services. They are in charge of Head Start, Head Start, easiest way to think about it is it provides pre-K for economically poor neighborhoods. Another place we get funding, the Department of Labor. Supports a youth employment and training activities. Youth employment and training activities. We also have a program called Youth Build. So they fund certain high school curriculum activities to provide for on-the-job training in high schools. Filling needs the Department of Labor has identified as places that high school graduates are likely to get a job but may be underexperienced, so they go into schools and provide it. And then the final one I'm going to mention, but it's the military, which means they don't really disclose how much money they spend like these other groups, but it's ROTC and JROTC. JROTC, Junior ROTC, and ROTC. This is military training that exists in schools and groups where you can go through the steps of your military training, usually in exchange for a scholarship at a lot of places if you agree to military service after college. In some places it's not even tied to a scholarship, it's just a group where there will be a military recruiter who exists on the high school's campus that helps people figure out if they want to commit to military service after high school. The ROTC. And then they just put a J in front of it, JROTC, which is really the secondary education. And there are colleges that exist too, like Texas A&M, where there's service that you can exist in, where you go through the military training during your time on campus. One of my college roommates, former roommates, was in the ROTC program, and as soon as he graduated, he went off and served for 4 years in the Army, and then he came back and went to law school. But that's what he used to pay for school. So that's what those programs exist for in secondary and primary and in secondary schools. There are no elementary ROTC programs, although we did find that there's a few that are in like middle schools where they've started clubs, but those aren't really ran by the federal government or the state governments, what I can understand. Okay, last few notes about funding is that federal education is always distributed through formulas and grants. The formula, for example, would be that poverty one that I gave you, 130% of the poverty level, then you get X amount of money, or a grant, which is like apply for it, prove that you need it, and we'll give it to you. That 13%, by the way, which is the average, there are some states where it's less than 3%. There are some states, the state of Michigan stood out when I saw, which was 19% of the money available for schools in the state of Michigan come from the federal government. So it just kind of varies state to state, basically because it depends on how much each state is already giving to education. Because if the federal government says, here's money per student, and they give it, there are going to be some schools in some states where that's a big chunk of cash, and there are going to be others where that's going to seem negligible. I want to repeat, none of the money is mandatory. I know it's weird to point out, but states can say no to federal funding, and some do. the three big funding disparities that exist, and so if you're reading about all this, you'll notice that what schools spend on, how much money they spend per student. There are kind of three categories I wanted to point out. The first I've mentioned a couple of times. There's a lot of interstate disparity. That just means that the state of Georgia spends a lot more per student than the state of Mississippi. And the state of New York spends a lot more per student than the state of Georgia. And the state of Massachusetts spends a lot more per student than the state of New York. So just what state you live in matters. And a lot of federal funding is aimed at fixing that. Second, there are intra-state, I-N-T-R-A state disparities. This is kind of the one that I spoke about in terms of teacher salary, and that is inequities within a particular state. So some regions have a lot of money, other regions don't have a lot of money. The state of Georgia is just fascinating because such a large percentage of the population is in around this circle of roads that are crumbling and falling apart, and they all going to live here. But then there's huge portions of the state. It's a fairly large state, and it's kind of spread out. And then the intrastate disparities will often be referenced as the money that's available in Atlanta schools is different from the money that is available for Bibb County schools, is different from the money that's available for Ware County schools, which is different from the Columbus, Georgia schools, because there's no universal state law there. And then finally, there are intra-district disparities. There's Title I funding for individual schools within the same district that are not getting money because there are states where the money just stays exactly where it is taken. Giant counties where the North Fulton schools get to keep the tax money from the North Fulton housing and property taxes, and the South Fulton schools keep the money from the South Fulton taxes and property, and so there ends up being a large disparity even within that based on how the laws will work. I point out all of these disparities because they're something discussed in the No Child Left Behind in terms of Title I funding and grants, in terms of the way they deal with and try to educate and fund people. Schools, teachers, stuff like that. The next section will be on the regulations that exist, the things that can and should be regulated. The biggest section will be Section A, constitutional rights. What places has the federal government stepped in and provided regulations to meet constitutional rights? Number one, I've already mentioned it, it's the IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. That is a federal law that governs how states and public education agencies serve children with disabilities from birth to age 21. It lays out certain legal standards that states must meet. It recognizes that those can be an added expense. And so what does it do? It provides funding. This gets back to the original thing I said where funding and regulation aren't all that separated. It says, here's a bunch of rules you have to meet. Let's just be silly. Let's say that it says you have to provide wheelchair access to all students who need it, or all buildings, or all classrooms. And then the state say, well, that's an expense we don't have money for. The federal government says, well, as long as you're meeting all of the standards, here's a check for $1 million to do it and meet it. And then obviously how it defines disabilities and how it extends those things is defined at the federal level. There are constitutional cases, all sorts of stuff. Yes, ma'am? Yeah, it's a block grant as long as they are willing to comply. Number two is called Section 504. Section 504. That's the only thing it's referenced as. It took me a while to realize that it's actually Section 405 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. It prohibits all entities that receive any federal funding from discriminating on the basis of disability. Unconstitutional to discriminate against people with disabilities if you receive federal funding. So it's very similar to the IDEA, but there's no funding tied to it. It was the actual regulation. It's Section 504. If you get federal money, you can't discriminate based on disability. 3, FERPA applies to schools. FERPA is the Family, Education, Rights, Privacy Act. It's technically Rights and Privacy Act, but the A doesn't apply. So FERPA, F-E-R-P-A. It prohibits the disclosure of personal information from student records. You are not allowed to sell McDonald's the name of all of the students that exist in your district for profit. You are not allowed to disclose their medical information, any of their privacy stuff. Schools are required to protect all of that information. It is your privacy.
It just prevents disclosure of personal.
Yes, for all students, if you receive federal money, you are prohibited from doing so. Or you will lose federal money if you do. You just can't do it. It's unconstitutional for them to disclose any information. It applies to us as well. You can't just post your information. Yes, ma'am?
Is it only for people who receive federal money? Or
No, that's a constitutional requirement. That is breaking the law. There's also the PPRA, which followed that up, the Protection of Pupil Rights Amendment. It kind of expanded FERPA and said, you as students are protected in these 8 areas. These are 8 things that the school cannot disclose about you to anyone. They cannot disclose the political or religious beliefs of you or your parents. They cannot disclose the mental or psychological problems of you or your parents or family. Three, your sexual behavior, attitude, and identity is also protected. Your permanent record is what I call it. So any illegal, antisocial, self-incriminating behavior you take in schools. Your relationships, what's your family status? Are you adopted? Are you an orphan? Do you live with your aunt and uncle? Do you live with your grandparents? That's information that's protected. In addition to your religious beliefs, your religious practices are also covered. They can't mail it out. They can't publish on the websites like, here are all the Jews that won't be here because, this holiday that's happening. Income. You can't disclose who you are. So there are a lot of forms where the government says, how many poor kids do you have? And they can give them the numbers and they can have to prove it, but they have to be very careful about how they disclose that. Been reading a lot about school lunches and the free lunch program over the summer and stuff like that. It is a violation of your privacy rights under the PPRA if the lunch gentleman, lunch lady, lunch fella says, all the free school lunch kids get over here in this line. That's illegal. You can't do that. Why? It's a violation of your privacy rights. That is disclosing your financial information to someone. They can say, all the kids who brought their lunch from home get in this line. That's fine. They can't do the other thing. So like shaming, there's a couple of stuff. Other less tidily stuff that are required, Brown v. Board of Education, desegregation. Schools are absolutely obligated to be racially divided. It's tough to enforce. There's Title IX. Funding must be equal for boys and girls, particularly for extracurricular activities. This hit colleges a lot harder than it hit high schools, because colleges actually fund their athletic programs. Most athletic programs in high school exist sort of separate from the school. But if a private school is offering scholarships to boys to come play basketball, what does it have to do federally? Has to also offer scholarships to girls. It has to be equal. That's a Title IX regulation. All sorts of regulations exist in terms of employment and discrimination. They're literally too numerous to name when it comes to schools not protecting the individual rights of a person or a group of people. And I haven't even mentioned teachers and the way teachers' rights and unions and labor groups exist in this country that also need to be protected. In addition to constitutional, there are also regulations of curriculum. The regulations of the curriculum. No Child Left Behind says you have to meet certain standards. Doesn't say what those standards are. It did say if you are going to receive funding, you must pass this test. Common Core. See how the federal government did that? Very neat. I've said it a couple of times. There's not a federal accreditation group. What is there? There are regional accreditation groups that you must meet. They're not federal. Whoa, 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 whoa. Federal government's not telling you you've got to meet certain standards. That's the Southeastern Board of Education. And of course, they get funding from the federal government, and they're recognized by the federal government. But that's not us telling you got to do certain things. That's just if you want to get accredited, and then you got to be accredited if you want to get any of this money for us. And then to be accredited, by them, you've got to offer a certain number of languages, certain number of math, so many hours in the school. Everyone see that little cute little workaround that they've done there? The only other real regulations of curriculum that have happened, the USDA has provided certain nutrition education requirements on schools. If you want to continue to provide money for this, you need to teach certain things. But again, it's hard to call any of these regulations because they are not mandatory. They are what? Optional and tied to funding. There's no such thing as a federal curriculum that is a requirement, so it's hard to call it a regulation. It's more of a well-paid-for suggestion. The federal government basically just seems like the worst type of parents when it comes to regulating the behavior of the states. It's like, please clean up your room. I'll give you $1 million. Please make your bed. I'll give you double allowance. That's all you got to do. Like, okay, I'll do that. Or, I don't want to. Okay, I'm going to jump to the sort of aft neg ground section of it because we finish up at 10:30. Just confirming that that's true. 10:30, correct? 7:30. Okay, thanks, Brad. I don't know why I couldn't find that. Okay, the first section is the reasons why you would want to regulate and fund education. Things that you can think of. Category 1 is exclusion discrimination. That has been the history of education and federal involvement in this country. Whether it was segregation based on race, where it's Title IX based on gender, whether it's privacy laws, whether it's bathroom laws about providing for people based on sexual identity, all sorts of stuff. There are lots of different racism, sexism, homophobia type things where the government, disability, where the government could and should get involved on behalf of a minority group. That will be a huge section of background and advantages. I can't list them enough. Number 2, we are falling behind. America is not great again. This will be another category of advantages. You also notice, it'll be soft power for those with a little more debate experience, or just sort of like we're losing out to the Chinese. You know how much Japanese kids go to school 28 hours a day. It's unbelievable. Give them all time turners, they flip it back and take math again. American kids are just eating donuts and taking recess. Lots of good people like to talk about education in those terms. It'll be a very popular advantage. Third, there will be, yes?
Wouldn't all girls or all boys school be unconstitutional then?
No, it's private.
Oh, okay.
It's private. A lot of those schools, in response to concerns that they wouldn't be, are often connected to others, or a lot of them are religious, which means they don't have that. So the Carrollton School of the Sacred Heart, Miami, which is a very famous, very excellent debate school in Miami, it's religious, and they say for religious reasons they do it. And so the government, if you say religion, the government's usually, okay, sorry, we weren't asking any questions, sorry about that. But not all of them are. Boys and girls schools, they usually have a justification for why that has to happen on stuff. It's an example of a charter school. Charter school says that girls are falling behind because they're not being educated, that the boys are ruining them, so we want to start a girl-only school. The government says, okay, that sounds fine. Curriculum-specific advantages. Curriculum means what you teach. There will be a lot of stuff that says we should focus on this. Examples of law reviews that I've found where people have said that we need to educate kids more on stuff includes job skills. So the school program's doing a terrible job of preparing people to take jobs, and that's why things like manufacturing and the Industrial Revolution and people are leaving. Because students just aren't smart enough to take the high-level manufacturing jobs we need. Military education, this will be that ROTC. We need better soldiers. We need to be people. We need to use schools to put us back in the military. STEM education, I already mentioned that. Someone want to repeat what that acronym is for me real quick? Yes, sir?
Science, technology, engineering, mathematics.
Yeah, boom, love it. STEM education needs to happen. We need to do that. More engineering, more math, more technology. We need all sorts of stuff. We need more chemistry education in this country. Students just have no idea what chemistry is anymore. Need to double down. Someone's like, the federal government should require 2 years of chemistry. Foundation, we should have an organic and inorganic chemistry year for all students. Chemistry education is good for the next set of medical revolutions. We as a country are falling behind there. There's debate. This one I think is fascinating. Federal government should get involved in funding debate. What's your app? Debate's good. I find that to be totally interesting. There's lots of good studies on it written by a lot of people. I know them that say debate is good, critical education, makes you learn stuff. Other team responds to some argument. They're like, how do you know that's true? Because of debate. Ha-ha, vote app. It's going to be great. Yes, sir?
Wait, so if private schools, if they don't receive federal funding, they don't have to abide by like the constitutional rights?
They do have to for the constitutional right, but there's no constitutional right to go to school with girls. But they do, they can't violate privacy.
If they don't receive federal funds, they can discriminate however they want.
That's untrue. You can't discriminate against someone. It depends on what you mean by discriminate, but like employers can't discriminate against pregnant women and fire them because they're pregnant. They don't get any money from the federal government because there's a constitutional right to be protected. For that, it's a protected class. Yes, sir. 2 more questions, I'm going to go back to my list. Yeah.
How does privacy get violated?
How does privacy get violated? Well, whose lab are you in?
What?
Whose lab are you in? What group?
Anthony's lab.
Who? No, I need to know the adult who is teaching you. There is no Andy here.
Anthony.
Oh, Anthony and Eric. I'm gonna tell Eric to email me how he answers that question. I am fascinated to see how he does with it. And your question was, how does privacy get violated? Let me know. Yes, sir.
So this kind of goes back to earlier when you were talking about the federal funding going to schools about the disability.
Okay.
So if I'm not mistaken, being disabled is a protected class.
Correct.
So how are, you said that only if, what's it called? I think it was in the,
You write this question now. I'm going to keep going, but I'm going to come back to it when it's more
it was
organized.
in this section.
All right, next sections we've got educational achievement will just be an advantage. We need to be smarter. We're smarter, we're better, we're smarter. Just sort of this can take on any sort of flavor. Education is intricately tied to the economy and economic growth. Lots of the ways. The categories that I have already found is the deficit. Spending too much money. I mean, we're talking $40 billion a year to the government. You know how many sweet missiles you can buy with that? Competitiveness. That is the fancy economic way of saying that we're not keeping up, that the U.S. economy is not as good as other economies, that we're relying on people. So, I skipped over doctors and medical education up there under chemistry, if you want to throw that down there. Like, we're just not prepared. High school's not preparing students with a background to be pre-med to go on, is something that's mentioned a lot. In addition to competitiveness, the economy could be tied to certain jobs that need to be filled, that we just don't have enough job-ready human beings in this country.